Good evening. I'm Ian Wardropper, Director of the Frick Collection. It gives me particular pleasure to introduce Adam Eaker, who will be giving a lecture titled Sitting for Van Dyck. The exhibition Van Dyck, The Anatomy of Portraiture, is the largest and one of the most important shows that the Frick has ever mounted. The idea was first proposed to me in 2011, and we had the good fortune that soon after, Adam applied for an Anne L. Poulet curatorial fellow position. This is a program that's been going on for some 15 years and attracts top graduate students in art history to work for 2 years at the Frick, to learn curatorial practices, hopefully to finish their dissertation, and to produce an exhibition. Generally, these exhibitions are relatively modest, but because the subject of Adam's dissertation at Columbia University was Lore of the Studio, Van Dyck, Rubens, and the Status of Portraiture, we immediately put him to work on this exceptional exhibition. We kept him on after the 2 years to complete the exhibition, which he co-curated with Stein Ulsteins. What they produced was an absorbing examination of the creative process of Van Dyck's portraits, following through drawings and oil sketches, the preparation for paintings, as well as the role of etchings and engravings in disseminating his images. This is the first exhibition to fully explore this process, and the first in over 20 years on Van Dyck in this country. Adam received his BA at Yale and was a research assistant at the Yale Center for British Art on an exhibition of drawings from the collection of Charles Reiskamp, who many of you know was a former director of the Frick. With a research fellowship from the Belgian American Educational Foundation, he was a visiting scholar at the Rubenianum in Antwerp, 2012-2015. In addition to his essay and entries for the catalog for the Van Dyck exhibition, he has an article out in the Art Bulletin, Van Dyck Between Master and Model, June 2015. And I'm happy to report that he successfully defended his doctoral dissertation at Columbia last week. So he now has his PhD. His knowledge and skills have been noticed by another museum in the city. Yeah, absolutely. His knowledge and skills have been noticed by another museum in the city, so last month he began as assistant curator of Northern Baroque painting at the Metropolitan Museum. We are sorry to lose Adam, who has been a delight to work with over the past 2.5 years, but we are proud of his accomplishments, and we look forward to following his future achievements. A brochure outlines other lectures and symposia for the Van Dyck show, including a symposium, America and the Art of Flanders, collecting paintings by Rubens, Van Dyck, and their circles, which will be here May 13th and 14th, and at which Adam will also speak not once but twice, once as former curator at the Frick and once as present curator at the Metropolitan Museum. Following his lecture tonight, the exhibition will be open for half an hour, and I hope you will return to see this wonderful show before it closes on June 5th. Please welcome Adam Eaker.
Thank you so much, Ian, for that really lovely introduction. And I'd just like to say how meaningful and really life-changing my 2.5 years at the Frick were. It's been such a delight to work with my colleagues here and curate this show. Our exhibition, Van Dyck, The Anatomy of Portraiture, attempts to peel back the layers of Van Dyck's celebrated portraits and reconstruct the artist's working method as he set about capturing a likeness. A highlight of the show is a group of 4 paintings displayed alongside the drawings that prepared them. By moving between drawing and painting, visitors are able to trace Van Dyck's decision-making as he adjusted a pose or altered a detail of his sitter's appearance. For example, in a drawing of the court musician Nicholas Lanier, Van Dyck worked with black and white chalk on blue paper, swiftly laying out the fall of fabric in the sitter's cloak, the play of his curls, his elegant hands, and his almost supercilious expression. The drawing provided Van Dyck with all the basic elements of the final portrait, which comes to us from the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna. The 2 works are reunited at the Frick for the first time since they left the artist's studio. Our juxtaposition reveals, however, that Van Dyck made a number of changes in the final composition. Instead of holding out a glove in his right hand, Lanier's arm is akimbo, the hand tucked invisibly at his side. Less obviously, Van Dyck removed a lock of hair to leave Lanier's temple exposed. These alterations indicate how Van Dyck continued to think through his composition as he transitioned from preparatory drawing to canvas. Visual comparisons and preparatory works are not, however, our only source of insight into Van Dyck's working method. Van Dyck was a true celebrity in his own day, and he inspired a large and diverse group of responses on the part of poets, dramatists, and other writers. These include a number of colorful anecdotes about his portrait sittings, such as the following story told by the painter Peter Lilly about Van Dyck's portrait of Lanier before you on the screen. On the 20th of April, 1672, Lilly paid a call on his new acquaintance, Mary Beale. Lilly was the most important painter working in England in the generation after Van Dyck, celebrated for his portraits of beautiful women at the court of Charles II. Beale, meanwhile, had her own successful practice as a portraitist and copyist. As recorded in the diary of her husband, Charles, Lilly first praised Mary Beale's copy of a family portrait by Van Dyck as the best imitation he had ever seen of that artist, who had died some 30 years before. A discussion of Van Dyck's portraits ensued, and in particular of the legendary speed at which he worked. When Charles Beale expressed his wonderment that Van Dyck was able to capture a perfect likeness in a single day, Lilly countered with the following tale about Van Dyck's portrait of Lanier, which he claimed had required a full week of concentrated labor. Mr. Lanier himself told me he sat 7 entire days for it to Sir Anthony, and that he painted upon it all of those 7 days, both morning and afternoon, and only intermitted the time they were at dinner. And he said likewise that though Mr. Lanier sat so often and so long for his picture, yet he was not permitted so much as once to see it, till he had perfectly finished the face to his own satisfaction. This was the picture which, being showed to King Charles I, caused him to give order that Van Dyck should be sent for over into England. Lilly told his story, and Charles Beale wrote it down in his diary, because Mary Beale was an artist with a deep interest in portrait sittings. Early in her career, Beale internalized Van Dyck's legacy by making copies of his portraits. These included her miniature version of Van Dyck's portrait of the Porter family that she showed to Lilly. But Beale also sought to observe the workings of portrait sittings firsthand. Shortly after Lilly's visit recounted above, she and her husband arranged to have their friend John Tillotson sit for Lilly, paying the artist in both cash and pigments so that Mary Beale could study his technique. In his notebook, Charles Beale recorded the sittings that he and his wife witnessed in Lilly's studio. For example, on June 5th, 1672, Dr. Tillotson sat about 3 hours to Mr. Lilly for him to lay in a dead color of his picture for me. He, apprehending the color of the cloth upon which he painted was too light, before he began to lay on the flesh color, he glazed the whole place where the face and hair were drawn in color, over thin with cologne earth and a little bone black, as he told us, made very thin with varnish. In his capacity as Mary Beale's business manager and the chronicler of her studio, Charles would make equally detailed notes on the progress of her own portraits across a series of sittings. For 17th century artists, the sitting was a critical site for the transmission of artistic knowledge and the cultivation of social relations between painters and sitters. Many sources, ranging from diaries like Charles Beale's to love poems and comic dramas, allow us to reconstruct 17th century portrait sittings with a level of detail absent from any earlier period. Within these texts, certain themes surface again and again, most prominently the dissemination of artistic expertise and the artist's performance of his or her own gentility. But there was also a dark side to the portrait sitting, expressed in recurrent triangular rivalries between painter, sitter, and a jealous observer of their intimacy. The potentially fraught nature of the portrait sitting can even be gleaned from Lilly's changing behavior toward the Beales as he painted their friend's portrait. On August 1st, 1672, Charles recorded, "Dr. Tillotson sat to Mr. Lilly about 3 hours. His manner in the painting of this picture this time especially seemed strangely different, both to myself and my dearest heart. This we thought was a more concealed, mysterious, scanty way of painting than the way he used formerly, which we both thought was a far more open and free, and much more was to be observed and gained from the seeing him paint then." When it gradually dawned on Lily that Beale was not simply an admiring amateur, but also a professional rival, he began to guard his artistic secrets from her. As in this example, what would initially seem to be a dyad of portraitist and sitter is often revealed in early modern sources to have in fact been a triangle, with all of the jealousy and rivalry that structure implies. Tonight, I'll explore a body of early modern English literary sources that all responded to Van Dyck's legacy by focusing on the portrait sitting. In their own writings, painters emphasized the social opportunities afforded by the sitting, but poets and playwrights were more likely to cast it as a threat to the social and sexual order. An engagement with 17th-century anecdotes, poems, and comic dramas that take the sitting as a motif allows us to understand something of the revolutionary impact of Van Dyck's innovation of the portrait and complements this exhibition's exploration of his working method. Peter Lilly was not alone in telling stories about Van Dyck's portrait sittings. Just as Lanier had passed his account on to Lilly, others who sat to Van Dyck served as informants for his earliest biographers. From Sir Kenelm Digby, for example, the Roman biographer Giovan Pietro Bellori acquired the following information. Concerning his mode of painting, he was in the habit of executing his work straight off, and when he was making portraits, he would begin them in the morning early, and without interrupting his work, he would keep those lords to dine with him. Even if they were important personages and great ladies, they went there gladly, as if for recreation, attracted by the variety of entertainments. After dinner, he would return to the work, or else he might have painted 2 in one day, finishing them later with some retouching. For his part, the French writer Roger de Piel spoke to the banker and collector Everhard Jabach, who had thrice sat to Van Dyck, obtaining an even more detailed account. The painter gave the day and hour to the persons whom he had to paint, and never worked more than an hour at a time on a portrait, whether it be to sketch it out or to finish it. And when his clock told him that the hour was up, he would rise and bow to the person to indicate that that was enough for one day, and would make an appointment for another day and another hour, after which his valet came to clean his brushes and prepare another palette, while he received the next person to whom he had given an appointment. He worked thus at several portraits during the same day with extraordinary swiftness. Although their timeline of the artist's working method differs from Lilly's anecdote, these descriptions of Van Dyck in the studio also emphasize his mastery and control. It is Van Dyck who performs the role of gracious host and entertains sitters at his residence, whereas another, lesser painter might travel to their homes. And it is Van Dyck who determines the length of the sitting, elaborating a carefully scripted choreography to which each session adheres. In the case of Lanier, Van Dyck's self-assurance even extended to denying his sitter a glimpse of his own portrait until it was finished to the artist's satisfaction. The widespread fascination with portrait sittings in the second half of the 17th century is inextricable from the pan-European reception of Van Dyck. It was through his example, arguably more than that of any other artist, that writers thought about portrait sittings. The gifts of portraits that Charles I and Henrietta Maria made to foreign courts cemented the fame of Van Dyck's English portraits abroad and excited curiosity about his working method and public persona. For example, when Van Dyck's likeness of Charles I in 3 positions was dispatched to Rome as the basis for a sculpture by Bernini, the painting was exhibited at the Pantheon. It subsequently entered Bernini's personal collection and may have been the inspiration for his own celebrated method of taking a portrait by observing a sitter from a variety of angles as he or she continued to speak and move naturally. During the English Civil War, exiled royalists arrived on the continent with more portraits in tow and served as informants for writers like Bellori, further diffusing knowledge of Van Dyck's portrait sittings. On the basis of Sir Kenelm Digby's account, for example, Bellori describes sitting for Van Dyck as a solazzo, a recreation, and archival documentation confirms that even Charles I traveled to Van Dyck's home to sit for the painter and see his collection. The appeal of visits to Van Dyck's studio as a form of entertainment may have been reinforced by the proximity of his house to the theatrical district of Blackfriars. Such an association becomes apparent in a letter from the late winter of 1636, in which Prince Charles Louis of the Palatine reported to his mother on the progress of a portrait of Charles I. The king sat yesterday at Van Dyck's. His house is close by Blackfriars, where the queen saw Ludwig Carlyle's second part of Arviragus of Felicia acted, which is hugely liked of everyone. Contemporary theater, meanwhile, parodied the association between fashionable life and sittings with foreign painters like Van Dyck. In James Shirley's The Lady of Pleasure from 1637, the title character, already lampooned for spending a fortune on, quote, gaudy furniture and pictures of this Italian master and that Dutchman, unquote, is called off stage to sit for her portrait by, quote, the Belgic gentleman. As Shirley's reference to the Belgic gentleman indicates, Van Dyck's portrait sittings inspired poets and playwrights almost from the moment of his arrival in London. For example, in a tribute to the painter's portrait of his beloved Dorothy Sidney, the poet Edmund Waller playfully asked Van Dyck, "Why thou couldst not at one essay the face to aftertimes convey which this admires? Was it thy wit to make her off before thee sit? Confess, and we'll forgive thee this, for who would not repeat that bliss, and frequent sight of such a dame buy with the hazard of his fame?" Waller's conceit depends on the idea that Van Dyck's fame derived from his ability to capture a likeness at one essay, that is, in a single sitting. According to Waller, Van Dyck's repeated sittings with the poet's muse not only threatened this reputation, but also recast the portrait sitting as a form of seduction, in which Van Dyck exploited his control over the artistic process to obtain the bliss of studying a beautiful woman. Because Dorothy Sidney was not Waller's actual mistress, but rather the object of unrequited, idealizing admiration, Van Dyck's time alone with her acquired an additional edge. With even greater ambivalence than Waller, the poet Ben Jonson recognized the sitting's potential for a love triangle between painter, lover, and beautiful sitter. The third section of Jonson's poetic cycle, Euphemy, a tribute to the recently deceased Venetia Digby, opens with the famous court beauty sitting for her picture by an unnamed painter. Sitting and ready to be drawn, what makes these velvets, silks, and lawn, embroideries, feathers, fringes, lace, where every limb takes like a face? Send these suspected helps to aid some form defective or decayed. This beauty without falsehood fair needs not to clothe it, but the air. Yet something, to the painter's view, were fitly interposed. So new he shall, if he can understand, work with my fancy his own hand. Jonson describes Venetia as sitting and ready to be drawn, that is, awaiting the arrival of her portraitist. In a nod to Venetia's beauty, Jonson dismisses the velvet, silks, and lawn that disguise her enticing limbs. Having thus beguiled the reader with a mental image of Venetia clothed in naught but the air, Jonson moves on to an exposition of his own poetic gifts. He will, after all, allow something to be interposed between Venetia's beauty and the painter's view, not clothes to disguise it, but rather poetic fancy to assist the painter. Jonson opposes this fancy, what we might otherwise term invention, with the painter's hand, a tool that can only function with the guidance of the poet. He thus emphasizes the visual artist's status as a manual, not intellectual laborer. Indeed, in the following section of Euphemy, Jonson summarily dismisses his imagined portraitist with the lines, "Painter, you are come, but may be gone. Now I have better thought thereon. Beside, your hand will never hit to draw a thing that cannot sit." I'm glad Ben Jonson can still get a laugh. Like Venetia's velvet, silks, and lawn, Jonson considers painted representation to be ultimately superfluous, and he likens the portraitist's work to a kind of cosmetic deception or falsehood fair of which true beauty has no need. The unnamed painter of Euphemy is a straw man, enlisted in a rehearsal of tropes about the portrayal of beautiful women that had been current in European literature since the sonnets of Petrarch. In poems about portraits of his beloved Laura, Petrarch had lamented the picture's lack of a voice. The subgenre of instructions to a painter, meanwhile, extended back to the lyrics of the Greek anthology. Yet Jonson's evocation of his richly dressed sitter awaiting the arrival of her portraitist has a contemporary specificity that many poems in this tradition lack. And unlike most of those earlier lyrics, which engage with fictional works of art, Johnson's euphemy is also an agonistic response to the very real portraits that Anthony van Dyck had painted of Venetia Digby. A famous beauty married to the courtier and natural philosopher Sir Kenelm Digby, who would later inform Ballory about Van Dyck's studio practice, Venetia died suddenly in her sleep on May 1st, 1633, at the age of 32. In a letter to his brother, Sir Kenelm described Venetia's premature death and posthumous portrayal by Van Dyck. When we came in, we found her almost cold and stiff, yet her blood was not so settled but that our rubbing of her face brought a little seeming color into her pale cheeks, which continued there till she was folded up in her last sheet. And Sir Anthony van Dyck hath expressed this excellently well in his picture. Van Dyck's portrait of Venetia reflects the anomalous circumstances of the deathbed sitting in its unusual composition. In the upper corners of the painting, bed curtains part to reveal a close-up image of the deceased, framed in the manner of a proscenium. Despite its poor condition, the portrait still conveys a powerful oscillation between the appearance of sleep and indications of death. In one disturbing naturalistic detail, Venetia's left eyelid lifts slightly to reveal the eye underneath, while the right lid is firmly shut. Dark locks of hair spill out of her nightcap, and her cheeks are indeed flushed with the little seeming color that Sir Kenelm described. Venetia's gesture of cradling her head in one hand seems to assert her liveliness, even as it mimics, with a traditional signifier of melancholy, the emotional state inspired by her posthumous portrait. Digby was one of Ben Jonson's major patrons, and the poet wrote his euphemy cycle as much in honor of Venetia's widower as of Venetia herself. Yet in their writings, Jonson and Digby display very different attitudes toward portraiture. Although meditating on her death, Jonson imagines Venetia sitting in fashionable attire for an anonymous portraitist who cannot hope to capture her essence. Digby, by contrast, describes a post-mortem examination in which Van Dyck produced a haunting stand-in for his lost wife, a painting that is both a, quote, shadow and a masterpiece, quote, so like Venetia that those who saw her before she was put in her coffin will swear it is she. When Jonson contended that a painter's hand will never hit to draw a thing that cannot sit, he was arguing against just such a belief in portraiture's power to serve as a surrogate for a missing person. Lyrics by English poets such as Donne or Carew frequently opposed the greater accuracy of the image in the lover's heart to that produced by the painter. In the euphemy poems, Jonson mapped the traditional rivalry between poets and painters onto a love triangle that curiously eclipsed Venetia's widower and took the portrait sitting as its arena of combat. In the various written and painted memorials to Venetia, artistic and erotic competition overlap. Even before Van Dyck's posthumous depictions of her, Sir Kenelm's own writings had made portraits a focus for sexual rivalry. In the prose romance known as the Loose Fantasies that he composed as a roman à clef based upon his courtship of Venetia, the character Stelliana mistakenly believes Kenelm's alter ego Theagenes to have died abroad, and in her grief allows herself to become the mistress of Mardonsius, just as Venetia was said to have done with the Earl of Dorset. Mardonsius marks his triumph by displaying Stelliana's portrait, quote, as a glorious trophy of her conquered affections, unquote. When Stelliana and Theagenes are finally reunited, she refuses to marry him until he can recover this portrait, asserting that, quote, she would never suffer that one man should possess her and another such a gauge of a former, though half-constrained, affection, unquote. This episode, apparently based on a real dispute over Venetia's likeness, concretizes the triangular structure of the Petrarchan tradition, although its protagonists lack the rival identities of poet and painter. Love triangles revolving around portraits had a clear classical precedent in the tale of Apelles and Campaspe. According to the Roman writer Pliny, Alexander the Great was so taken with Apelles' portrait of Alexander's mistress Campaspe that he bestowed his concubine upon the painter. Of course, the competition aroused by the triangle of sitter, painter, and observer did not necessarily have to be erotic, as when Lilly worked to guard his professional secrets from Mary Beale, a female painter whose gender gave its own complicated inflection to her practice and reception. But writers like Waller and Johnson worried that male painters' emulation of gentlemen might extend to appropriating the pose of the lover. In the theatricalized studios where artists played the role of aristocrats, they performed for a double audience of both beautiful sitters and ambivalent male patrons. The dramatic potential of the sitting was not lost on playwrights, as when John Lyly took the story of Apelles and Campaspe as the subject of a play printed in 1584 that was the earliest English theatrical representation of a painter. But even as artists like Rubens and Van Dyck enjoyed triumphs at the English court, such dramatic depictions of painters became paradoxically ever more denigrating. In 1600, the schoolboys of St. Paul staged a romantic comedy by an unknown author entitled The Wisdom of Dr. Doddy Paul, whose opening scene depicts a portrait sitting. In an ambiguous assertion of painting's nobility, the play's painter is eventually revealed to be an earl in disguise, who takes advantage of the sitting to achieve clandestine proximity to his beloved. But by 1650, when Van Dyck's career was at its height, a more representative depiction was Dainty, a pickpocket who poses as a painter in Richard Brome's The Court Beggar. Brome gives voice to his audience's anxiety about the abundant nudity in the continental paintings then being imported by Charles I and his courtiers. In the play, a chambermaid who aspires to model for such works declared, "I have heard that limmers or picture drawers do covet to have the fairest and best featured wives, or if not wives, mistresses, that they can possibly purchase, to draw naked pictures by, whom they make to sit or stand naked in all the several postures, and to lie as many ways to help their art in drawing. Who knows how I may set his fancy a work?" Paintings like Van Dyck's Cupid and Psyche combined sensual nudity with claims of Neoplatonic transcendence. Brome's chambermaid vividly punctured such pretensions by insisting on sexual transgression as a foundational practice of art. The erotic possibilities of the sitting also colored more direct instances of English playwrights responding to Van Dyck's success, with characters clearly based upon him appearing in English drama by the early 1630s. In Shirley's The Ball, first performed in 1632, the character Freshwater teases Lady Rosamond for having her portrait painted by an Englishman, recommending instead that she, quote, "trust your face with the Dutch," and seek out a painter that can please the ladies every way. You shall not sit with him all day for shadows. He has regalios and can present you with suckets of 14 pence a pound, Canary prunellas, Venice glasses, Parmesan sugars, Bologna sausages, all from Antwerp. In the face of this enticing litany, Rosamond responds, "I have heard of him by a noble lady, told me the other day that sitting for her picture she was stifled with a strange perfume of horns." This exchange's graphic litany vividly conveys the fear of cuckoldry that is so characteristic of literary depictions of portrait sittings. Nonetheless, jealous lovers represent only one response to Van Dyck's English triumph. Another, unambivalently admiring stance emerges in a famous letter from 1637 addressed to Van Dyck by the Earl of Newcastle. "Noble Sir, the favors of my friends you have so transmitted unto me, as the longer I look on them, the more I think them nature and not art. It is not my error alone. If it be a disease, it is epidemical, for such power hath your hand on the eyes of mankind. Next the blessing of your company and sweetness of conversation, the greatest happiness were to be an Argus, or all over but one eye, so it or they were ever fixed upon that which we must call yours." In his letter, Newcastle imagines a complete bodily surrender to the power of Van Dyck's paintings, a becoming all over but one eye, fixed forever on the sight of Van Dyck's portraits. Yet even this pleasure is subordinated to the blessing of Van Dyck's company and sweetness of conversation. Praising the artist for his portraits of Newcastle's friends, the Earl makes clear that Van Dyck's comportment has elevated him to that elite company. As central as the triangular relationship between lover, mistress, and painter is for the European tradition, it exists in tension with another triangle, that implied by the so-called friendship portrait, which puts the relationship of two sitters on show for a third party outside the frame. In one such double likeness, Van Dyck commemorated his friendship with the English courtier Endymion Porter, whose family portrait Mary Beale would copy 4 decades later. The two men appear side by side, both looking out at the beholder, although Van Dyck poses in such a way that he appears to be momentarily distracted as he turns toward his friend. Their physical intimacy is heightened by the disruptive detail of Van Dyck's gloved index finger, extended to almost but not quite graze Porter's bare knuckle. In this portrait, Van Dyck's posture, his placement in the traditionally female heraldic sinister, i.e. beholder's right of the painting, and his more muted attire all establish him in a slightly deferential relationship to Porter. The artist appears almost to have slipped out from behind the easel to insinuate himself into his patron's portrait. Contemporary gossip linked the two men in yet another love triangle, one in which Van Dyck himself played the role of cuckold. Around 1652, Richard Simmons remarked in his miscellaneous biographical notes on Van Dyck that 'twas wondered by some that knew him that he would keep a mistress of his in his house, Mrs. Lemon, and suffer Porter to keep her company. Although she is the object of much historical speculation, we know almost nothing about Van Dyck's mistress, Margaret Lemon, who appears in our exhibition in both a portrait and print. Perhaps the prurient anecdote that Simmons recorded, positing a mistress contested between Van Dyck and Porter, was a means of diffusing the disturbing intimacy of their double portrait. In any case, the inscription on the engraving of Lemon in our exhibition, identifying her as Van Dyck's mistress, reveals the keen interest in the artist's private life on the part of early collectors. In 18th century biographies of Van Dyck, tales of his effrontery and violation of class boundaries multiplied, much to the fascination of those who have attempted psychological readings of his work. But these later anecdotes, written down decades after Van Dyck's death, primarily demonstrate the general perception that portrait sittings were socially fraught situations and that Van Dyck's conduct within them was exemplary. Introducing one such episode in A Life of the Artist published in 1729, the Dutch writer Jacob Campbell-Weyerman declared that Van Dyck should serve, quote, as a model for other great masters who often let themselves be treated like lackeys by gilded donkeys, unquote. In Weyerman's tale, Van Dyck is summoned to paint the Bishop of Ghent, but has an angry confrontation with his condescending sitter, and the artist goes so far as to suggest that the bishop fetch his equipment from an anteroom. Weyerman follows up on this tale with a series of quips that Van Dyck is said to have exchanged with his royal patrons in England, flattering the Queen's hand because he expects, quote, an extraordinary reward from them, and sympathizing with the cash-strapped king since, quote, an artist who keeps an open table for his friends and an open purse for his mistresses, as I do, is now and then not unacquainted with the bottom of his cash box. These tales may bear no relation to Van Dyck's actual conversation during portrait sittings, but they speak volumes about his early reception. For writers like Weyerman, Van Dyck's familiarity and boldness with his social superiors, even to the point of insolence, was the defining feature of his public persona. He demonstrated that familiarity primarily in the context of the portrait sitting. The verbal acuity embodied in the quips attributed to Van Dyck recurs as a frequent attribute in early modern artist biographies. In his Life of Rubens, for example, de Piel recounts that, quote, Queen Maria de' Medici took such pleasure in his conversation that throughout the time he worked on the 2 cycles of painting that he made in Paris, Her Majesty was constantly behind him, charmed equally by hearing him speak and watching him paint. Antonio Palomino, meanwhile, compared the visits of Philip IV of Spain to Velázquez with those that Alexander the Great had made to Apelles. Velázquez, of course, depicted one such royal studio visit in Las Meninas, the greatest of all monuments to the intimacy between artists and royal sitters. As Palomino's comparison indicates, writers on princely studio visits were reworking another foundational anecdote from the natural history. According to Pliny, in addition to artistic skill, Apelles also possessed great courtesy of manners, which made him more agreeable to Alexander the Great, who frequently visited his studio. But in the studio, Alexander used to talk a great deal about painting without any real knowledge of it. And Apelles would politely advise him to drop the subject, saying that the boys engaged in grinding the colors were laughing at him. So much power did his authority exercise over a king who was otherwise of an irascible temper. Pliny's tale was well known in Van Dyck's day and the subject of many works of art, among them this depiction by the Flemish painter Willem van Hacht. Van Hecht transposed Pliny's anecdote to a fictional Antwerp gallery, blurring the lines between the collection and the studio. In the painting, Alexander gestures over Apelli's shoulder as the artist paints the emperor's mistress Campaspe, so that the composition unites the two famous anecdotes about the relationship between Apelles and Alexander. The point of Van Hecht's painting and of the anecdote itself is that within the studio, the artist's knowledge gives him the ultimate authority. For a select audience of artists and connoisseurs, such tales provided satisfying evidence of the transcendence of social hierarchies that artistic mastery might allow. Portrait sittings in general afforded a welcome opportunity for the artist to demonstrate his expertise not only in painting, but in polite conversation as well. As one character in Shirley's The Lady of Pleasure observes, quote, "Sittings but a melancholy exercise without some company to discourse," unquote. On the level of practice, artistic treatises offered suggestions to painters about the importance of conversation for banishing the tedium of posing for one's portrait. For example, Nicholas Hilliard counseled that discreet talk or reading, quiet mirth or music, offendeth not, but shorteneth the time and quickeneth the spirit, both in the drawer and he which is drawn. For the painter Edward Norgate, with whom Van Dyck lodged upon his arrival in England, engaging a sitter in conversation was also a means of obtaining the most natural likeness. He advised that during the, quote, sitting, you shall do well to bend your observations upon what conduces most to the likeness. And to this purpose, the party sitting is by occasion of discourse to be sometimes in motion, and to regard you with a friendly, merry, and jovial aspect, wherein you must be ready and sudden to catch and steal your observations. Occasionally, Van Dyck's portraits of sitters who were also friends give us a glimpse into the animation his company might inspire, as in this portrait of the publisher François Langlois, included in our exhibition. Hilliard and Norgate were professional artists offering advice to other practitioners who looked to improve their craft and assert themselves as gentlemen. In the context of a technical passage within his treatise on limning, Hilliard recalled, quote, "the words also and reasoning of Her Majesty Elizabeth I, when first I came in Her Highness' presence to draw, and how the Queen questioned him during her sitting on the subject of shading in portraiture." Befitting a treatise that consistently emphasizes the limmer's need to assert his own gentility, Hilliard's anecdote establishes both his own expertise and its utility to a royal sitter. Portrait sittings naturally awakened curiosity on the part of those portrayed about the mechanics of taking a likeness, and courtiers as well as painters took advantage of this opportunity to entertain an immobilized prince. As John Evelyn noted with complacency in a diary entry from January 10th, 1662, being called into His Majesty's closet, where Mr. Cooper, the rare limmer, was crayoning of his face and head, I had the honor to hold the candle whilst it was doing, during which His Majesty was pleased to discourse with me about several things relating to painting, engraving, etc. During another of Charles II's sittings with Cooper, shortly after the Restoration, the philosopher Thomas Hobbes took advantage of the opportunity to reintroduce himself to the king, who was, quote, diverted by Mr. Hobbes's pleasant discourse and soon rewarded him with a pension. The aspects of the artistic process that a sitter actually witnessed in the studio would have contributed to his or her own curiosity. Dupiel, drawing upon Everhard Jabach's account, noted the speed with which Van Dyck worked, and Bellori, relying upon Digby, described his method as alla prima. The surviving evidence of Van Dyck's unfinished paintings confirms that he usually painted sitters without the mediation of a detailed drawing of their faces. Instead, Van Dyck would roughly mark out a pose with anchoring lines in brown paint, proceeding to capture the sitter's face directly from life. This procedure often resulted in halo-like pentaments, demarcating the border between the area of Van Dyck's own autograph contribution and those of his workshop assistants. We see these halos clearly in two unfinished portraits included in our exhibition. Van Dyck's own conversation during the sitting likely more closely resembled Evelyn's technical discourse than the piquant repartee ascribed to the artist by earlier biographers. A variety of sources attest that many 17th century English aristocrats and scholars, far from disparaging the manual aspects of art making, were fascinated by artisanal trade secrets. In his commonplace book from the 1640s, Thomas Marshall recorded Van Dyck's own assertion that, quote, Most art lovers are so little aware of what the work of art they see really consists of that they find it difficult to point out a real master among hundreds, unquote. Perhaps as a result, Van Dyck's recorded discussions of art with English patrons and friends seem to have been particularly focused on imparting knowledge of its technical aspects. In one manuscript compiled over several decades, the French doctor Théodore Turquet de Mayerne made notes on the techniques and materials of painting. De Mayerne, who served as physician to 3 English monarchs in turn, had access to such court painters as Rubens and Van Dyck himself. In his manuscript, de Mayerne reveals a number of insights gleaned from Van Dyck, whom he termed a most excellent painter. Van Dyck recounted to the doctor his experimental use of fish glue or icing glass as a primer and his preference for orpiment as, quote, the most beautiful yellow one can imagine. The 2 men discussed the, quote, very excellent green, unquote, in the paintings of Orazio Gentileschi, then also resident in London, with Van Dyck speculating that the Italian artist used an herbal preparation to obtain this effect. De Mayerne's notes have been mined by conservators seeking to reconstruct Van Dyck's technique, but in their blend of practical insight, flattery, and aesthetic appraisal, they also offer us the most important surviving record of Van Dyck's celebrated conversational art. By the time Lilly told his anecdote about Van Dyck and Lanier to the Beales, portrait sittings had become a part of court spectacle under Charles II. George Virtue, who transcribed Charles Beale's diaries, also recorded a story about the young Godfrey Kneller outshining Lilly as the 2 worked simultaneously on portraits of the king before an audience of courtiers. Such a tale, with its echo of ancient stories of artistic competition, gains plausibility in the light of a diary entry written by Samuel Pepys on July 15, 1664, where he notes seeing the famous beauty Frances Stuart, quote, having her picture painted at Whitehall with the king and 20 more, I think, standing by all the while. More luridly, Charles II and Lilly conspired in a revision of Pliny's tale of Apelles and Campaspe in the form of a provocative depiction of the king's mistress, Nell Gwyn, as Venus. Again, according to Virtue, this picture was painted at the express command of King Charles II. Nay, he came to Sir Peter Lilly's house to see it painted when she was naked on purpose. In the painting, Cupid serves as a surrogate for the voyeuristic king, peering between Venus's legs as he lifts the drapery nestled there. Meanwhile, the courtesan's frank gaze implicates the beholder in a further triangular relationship with the figures in the painting. Gwyn's pose looks back to celebrated works of Venetian painting through the medium of Van Dyck's own Cupid and Psyche. After Charles I's execution, Lilly himself had acquired Cupid and Psyche, but Charles II, son of the executed king, assiduously reclaimed it and much of the rest of his father's collection upon the Restoration. Built upon a traffic in paintings and bodies between court and studio, Gwyn's portrait acknowledges the privileged access of the artist while affirming the royal beholder's ultimate possession of both sitter and painting. The noted impiety of Restoration court portraits, for which royal mistresses pose not just as Venus, but also as saints or even the Virgin Mary, reveals a sophisticated familiarity with the studio and wry acknowledgement that the depiction of saints had always depended on the recruitment of profane models. Our exhibition includes Van Dyck's own portrait of the Duchess of Havre in the guise of the Virgin, adored by the Savoyard diplomat Scalia, commemorating a private drama that no historian has yet been able to reconstruct. Just as the 17th century saw a surge in literary records of the portrait sitting, it also witnessed an exponential increase in the collection and preservation of preparatory works for portraits. Such drawings and oil sketches were particularly coveted by artists who sought inspiration for their own works. Van Dyck's sketch of Nicholas Lanier, for example, passed through the collections of no fewer than 3 painters, Prosper Henry Lankrink, Joseph van Aken, and Alan Ramsey, with Van Aken's and Lankrink's collector's marks visible on the recto of the drawing. Meanwhile, the portrait of the Porter family that Mary Beale copied appears to have been a touchstone for English artists. The 2 preparatory drawings for the portrait included in our exhibition bear the collection stamps of Lankrink and both Jonathan Richardson Sr. and Jr. Lanier himself formed the first significant collection of drawings in England, a practice in which he was emulated by Lilly. In their circulation among artists and art writers, Drawings and anecdotes both reinforced Van Dyck's standing and the fascination of his sittings in late 17th and 18th century England. Tracing such provenances reveals a historically self-conscious and self-referential tradition within early modern English painting. Mary Beale herself seized upon the interest in preparatory works when she painted a self-portrait in which she displays an unfinished canvas depicting her two sons, while her palette hangs from a peg in the background. Such an image figuratively invited viewers into Beale's studio and put her working method on view. On the continent, Jean Racine's, meanwhile, took portrait sittings as a subject of art. In his print, The Noble Painter of 1642, Abraham Bosse depicted an artist in a studio richly decorated with books, sculptures, and paintings. He sits before an easel that bears the portrait of an aristocratic sitter who stands alongside him to demonstrate the accuracy of the likeness. Placing a portrait at the heart of its depiction of artistic ennoblement, Bosse's engraving validates portraiture as the path to self-advancement. The proliferation of such images in the decade after Van Dyck's death supports the argument that they were closely linked to the pan-European spread of his fame. Indeed, one of the most important 17th century depictions of a portrait sitting was commissioned by Everhard Jabach, Van Dyck's patron and Roger de Peel's informant for the artist's studio practice. 3 times to Van Dyck, but also to Lilly and many other painters. Some 20 years after Van Dyck painted him, Jabach commissioned a massive family portrait from Charles Lebrun that was surely indebted to his experience of Van Dyck's London studio. 2 versions of this portrait were executed in short succession. One eventually entered the collection of the Berlin museums and was destroyed at the end of World War II, but the other, apparently primary version has recently resurfaced and been acquired by the Met. The Jabach family appears in an interior that recalls the richly furnished studio of Bosse's Noble Painter. But this space is more likely to be Jabach's own studiolo, filled with his paintings, books, sculptures, celestial globe, and mathematical instruments. One scholar interpreted the painting as the depiction of the wife and children's exceptional visit to this space of masculine learning. But they are not the only interlopers on the scene. In a mirror on the rear wall, we catch a glimpse of the artist himself, sitting at his easel as he dips his brush into a bit of white paint on his palette. Lebrun's pointed stare seems directed out of the canvas at us, the viewers of the painting, in a similar conceit to the reflection in Velázquez's Las Meninas. But in fact, Lebrun is looking at the Jabach family, and we are looking not only at their portrait, but also at their portrait sitting. Portrait sittings continue to offer fodder for artistic biographies well into the 20th century. The exhibition on Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun, currently on view at the Met, includes this charming depiction of an anecdote from the painter's memoirs, recounting how Marie Antoinette herself once stooped to pick up Vigée-Lebrun's brushes during a sitting. Meanwhile, as the premise for Meditations on Erotic Rivalry, the sitting had a long afterlife in English poetry. Robert Browning's My Last Duchess, for example, offers the chilling monologue of a Renaissance ruler displaying his murdered wife's portrait to a foreign envoy. As he gradually unveils the circumstances of the Duchess's death, much as he pulls back the curtain on her portrait, the Duke recalls the jealousy aroused by her sittings with the painter Fra Pandolf. "Sir, 'twas not her husband's presence only called that spot of joy into the Duchess' cheek. Perhaps Fra Pandolf chanced to say, 'Her mantle laps over my lady's wrist too much,' or paint must never hope to reproduce the faint half-flush that dies along her throat. Such stuff was courtesy, she thought, and cause enough for calling up that spot of joy." Even as he disclaims any skill in speech, the Duke witheringly evokes the shallow charm of the painter. Like Johnson before him, Browning's Duke perceives in the portraitist a rival whose claims must be decisively countered. Here, at the very tail end of the Petrarchan tradition, with its triangle of painter, lover, and beloved, the scene of the sitting reaches a lethal conclusion. Thank you.